All right, welcome everyone. Today, we're diving into the absolute core of psychopathology. We are moving way past your standard DSM symptom checklists, right? Instead, we're going to explore Sidney Blatt's integrative model. This is an essential structural tool for psychiatric formulation. We're going to look at exactly how the human mind forms, and more importantly, how its structural collapse leads to very specific clinical presentations. Here's our roadmap for this explainer. We'll start with the two fundamental lines of development, move into the analytic and introjective dimensions, contrast the two faces of clinical depression, map out personality pathology, and finally, look at the psychopathology continuum map. Section 1. The two fundamental lines of development. So the human mind doesn't just develop in a vacuum, right? According to Blatt, healthy personality development is essentially this lifelong, continuous dance, a mutually supporting dialectic between two things, interpersonal relatedness and self-definition. On one hand, you've got this deep need to connect, to form intimate bonds and attachments. On the other hand, you have the drive for self-definition, building your autonomy, your agency, a distinct identity. In a healthy mind, these two feed off each other. Secure attachments give you the safety to go out and figure out who you are. And conversely, having a solid sense of self allows you to form truly mature, intimate relationships without completely losing yourself in them.
Now, in normal development, as we just saw, there's this constant mutual support. But what happens when things go wrong? Psychopathology rears its head when this dialectical process gets totally thrown out of balance or completely fails. When there's a severe disruption, one of these developmental lines becomes rigidly overemphasized, literally at the expense of the other. The patient loses their psychological equilibrium and basically falls into one of two pathological extremes.
Section 2. The analytic dimension, or the overwhelming need for relatedness. Let's look at our first pathological extreme. Analytic preoccupation is an intense, frankly overwhelming focus on attachment, intimacy, and the need for care. And it's all driven by this chronic underlying terror of abandonment and loneliness. The word analytic literally means to lean on, and that's exactly what these patients do. Their entire psychic energy is totally consumed by dependency. They've got almost no internal autonomy to fall back on, so they rely entirely on external love objects just to maintain their psychological baseline.
So where does this come from? Developmentally, it usually starts with disrupted early attachments, maybe a caregiver who is inconsistent, absent, or just emotionally unavailable. If we look at this through an object relations lens, the intrapsychic mechanism is actually pretty tragic. The child internalizes that experience and forms a mental representation of an abandoning object. Because of that, their own self-representation becomes this inherently unlovable or helpless entity. To survive this terrifying internal landscape and just maintain whatever fragile connection they can, the ego leans heavily on primitive defenses.
Clinically, what you'll see are patients drowning in feelings of helplessness and weakness. They will make these frantic, sometimes wildly destructive efforts to avoid any kind of interpersonal separation, real or imagined. Because they literally cannot tolerate the reality of a flawed relationship or the threat of loss, they default to defenses like denial and disavowal, literally blinding themselves to their partner's toxic traits. They'll also use displacement and repression to completely bury any anger that might threaten that bond. Just listen to this internal monologue. I feel completely empty, weak, and terrified of being left unprotected. If they leave me, I am nothing. That is not an exaggeration. That is their literal psychic reality. Without someone else there, their very sense of self effectively ceases to exist. The clinical implications here are massive. These patients are incredibly vulnerable to rejection, even just perceived rejection from you, their therapist. You're looking at a huge risk of severe regression and overdependency in treatment. So your therapeutic challenge isn't just handing out insight, it's about actively managing the transference. You have to establish incredibly firm, consistent boundaries, while still remaining nurturing and emotionally available. Section 3. The introjective dimension, focusing on self-definition. Now, we swing to the exact opposite end of the spectrum. Introjective preoccupation is an intense focus on autonomy, control, self-worth, and absolute perfectionism. But here's the catch. This rigid armor actively masks a profound, agonizing sensitivity to failure and guilt. These patients view intimate relationships as secondary distractions, or worse, as direct threats to their autonomy and control. Developmentally, this structure usually stems from internalizing highly demanding, hypercritical parental figures. The child learns early on that love is strictly conditional on performance and compliance. Interpsychically, this creates a harsh, incredibly punitive superego. We're talking about a sadistic internal voice demanding absolute perfection. To ward off the crushing feelings of worthlessness this superego generates, the ego relies on rigid, ironclad control over themselves and everyone around them. Clinically, these folks look completely different from our analytic patients. You'll see excessive competitiveness and this obsessive drive for achievement. But underneath, they are constantly haunted by chronic guilt, feelings of failure, and relentless self-criticism. To keep a grip on things and distance themselves from vulnerable emotions, their go-to defense is intellectualization, stripping the emotion away and turning painful feelings into abstract concepts. They also lean heavily on reaction formation and rationalization to mask any unacceptable dependency or anger. Here is what it sounds like inside their head. No matter how much I achieve, it's never enough. Any mistake proves I am fundamentally flawed and guilty of failure. They are basically trapped in a mental courtroom where their own punitive ego ideal is acting as the judge, jury, and executioner, 24/7.
In the clinic, this translates to massive resistance to any kind of therapeutic intimacy or vulnerability. They will often try to turn therapy into an intellectual sparring match or a performance to prove their worth to you. Your main therapeutic challenge here? Softening that incredibly harsh superego. You've got to find a way to bypass their wall of intellectualization without triggering the massive, catastrophic shame hiding just beneath the rigid exterior.
Section 4. The two faces of clinical depression. This is where Blatt's polarities become incredibly practical. When a patient presents with depression, you can't just look at the surface. You have to figure out which structural collapse is actually happening. Analytic depression is usually triggered by a disruption in relationships. The core affect is loneliness, weakness, and fear of abandonment, stemming from that internal, abandoned self. Interjective depression, on the other hand, is triggered by perceived failure or a loss of autonomy. The core affect there is worthlessness and guilt, driven by a flawed self being crushed by an abusive superego. You absolutely cannot treat these the same way. One requires managing dependency and boundaries, while the other requires navigating extreme self-criticism and intellectual competition.
Section 5. Understanding personality pathology.
So how does this model explain the actual architecture of personality disorders? By integrating attachment and object relations, we see that a severe disruption in either developmental line completely arrests identity formation. If relatedness is severely impaired, the patient literally cannot internalize soothing objects. They can't self-soothe. If self-definition is stunted, it leads to identity diffusion. They have no independent sense of who they are. Ultimately, personality pathology emerges not just as a random cluster of bad behaviors, but as incredibly rigid, maladaptive relational patterns designed entirely to survive those core structural deficits. We can actually map major personality disorders directly onto these polarities. Borderline personality disorder, that's a chaotic collapse on the analytic side. You've got extreme abandonment fears, splitting, preoccupied attachment, and profound identity diffusion. Over on the introjective side, you have obsessive-compulsive personality disorder, or OCPD, driven by submission to a harsh superego, isolation of affect, and massive overcontrol. And schizoid personality disorder is fascinating here. They're essentially paralyzed, trapped right in the middle. They crave connection but are terrified of engulfment, so they retreat into isolation, which then triggers a terror of psychic collapse.
Section 6. The Psychopathology Continuum Map.
Let's pull the whole framework together into one single continuum. Picture it. In the balanced center, you have the healthy dialectic, where relatedness and self-definition synergistically support each other. But as the structure shifts to the extreme left, towards absolute relatedness, it collapses into anaclitic disorders, like dependent and borderline, where the self drowns in the need for connection. Conversely, as you move to the extreme right, towards absolute self-definition, the structure rigidly crystallizes into introjective disorders, like OCPD, paranoid, and schizoid personalities, barricaded behind control and isolation. So here's the critical question for your daily practice. When your next complex patient walks through the door, are you just going to count up their destructive symptoms? Or are you going to listen deeper? Are you going to use psychodynamic formulation to hear the structural collapse of their internal dialectic? Treating symptoms might offer a little temporary relief, but treating the underlying architecture of the mind, that is where true clinical healing actually begins.